November 1944. A signal relay station near Pont-à-Mousson, France. The air is thick with the scent of wet wool and the low hum of vacuum tubes. Radios crackle with the static of a continent at war. A message slip arrives at 0200 hours. It is a direct order for a regiment to attack. A young lieutenant reads the ink and slides the paper under a stack of reports. He does not relay the signal. He watches the minute hand of his watch crawl through the dark. He believes he is being merciful. He thinks he is saving lives by holding back the tide. He is wrong. While he sits in the quiet, 42 men are being torn apart in a valley they were never supposed to enter alone. General Patton is coming to show him that every minute of silence has a name. This is the true story of what happened when a single signal officer decided to play God with a divisional attack order, and the devastating response George Patton delivered when he found the bodies left in the gap. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the moments that forced people to face what they'd done. Sergeant Rita Dominguez was 27 years old and hailed from the dusty border town of El Paso, Texas. She served as the chief radio operator at the signal relay station, a role she had earned through a relentless attention to detail that left no room for error. Rita had grown up in a house where every penny was counted and every word mattered, and she brought that same fierce discipline to the Third Army. She had seen the casualty lists grow longer each week, and the knowledge that her own cousins were serving in the infantry made every transmission feel like a prayer. For Rita, the radio was not just a machine but a lifeline, a sacred trust between the men in the mud and the men in the maps. On this cold November night, she sat at her console, her eyes fixed on the logbook as the minutes began to slip away into a dangerous, unexplained silence. First Lieutenant Paul Sheridan was 24 years old, a son of privilege from Portland, Oregon, who viewed the war through a lens of intellectual superiority. He was a Signal Corps officer who prided himself on his tailored uniform and the fact that his hands remained clean while the rest of the world turned to grit. Sheridan carried a deep, quiet bitterness that had poisoned his sense of duty ever since his younger brother was killed in an infantry assault 2 months prior. He had developed a private conviction that the high-ranking officers at headquarters were disconnected from the reality of the front lines, viewing them as callous architects of slaughter. He often remarked to his peers that a man in his position had a moral obligation to protect the troops from their own commanders. He held the urgent attack order in his hand, looking at the ink with a sense of righteous defiance, believing that his personal judgment outweighed the requirements of his rank and the lives of the men waiting for the word. By November 1944, the lightning advance across France had ground to a muddy halt. General Patton's Third Army was facing a wall of German resistance along the Moselle River. Rain fell in cold, gray sheets that turned the Lorraine countryside into a graveyard of heavy equipment and sunken boots. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles back to the coast, leaving divisions hungry for shells and fuel. Every yard of ground had to be bought with blood and steel. The Allied High Command was pushing for a massive breakthrough before the full weight of winter froze the front lines and gave the enemy a time to dig in. In this environment, timing was everything. A coordinated assault required hundreds of moving parts to mesh with perfect precision. If the artillery opened fire 10 minutes late, the infantry was slaughtered in the open. If the flanking regiment failed to move at the appointed hour, the entire line was exposed to a lethal crossfire. The signal relay stations were the only thing holding these massive operations together. They were the thin copper wires and invisible radio waves that turned a general's intent into a soldier's action. Technical failures were expected. Wires were frequently cut by enemy shells or crushed by passing tanks. Radios were often drowned out by thick atmospheric static or German jamming. Because of this constant chaos, small delays were often overlooked by senior officers who were too busy fighting a war to audit every individual logbook. It was an environment where a man with a hidden agenda could easily find shadows to hide in. A 3-hour gap could be blamed on a broken generator or a fallen tree. But the shadows were disappearing as the sun began to rise over the relay station near Pont-à-Mousson. The glow of the vacuum tubes cast long, flickering shadows across the small room as Sergeant Dominguez stepped away from her console. She held a clipboard in one hand and the weight of a missing transmission in the other. She walked toward the small desk, where Lieutenant Sheridan sat staring at a stack of casualty reports. He didn't look up when she arrived. The silence between them was louder than the static coming from the headsets. Rita spoke first, her voice low and steady. "Lieutenant, the 0200 order hasn't cleared the logs yet." "I'm aware of the log, Sergeant. The regiment is scheduled to move at 0500. It's 0300 now. The line to the front is down. The static is too heavy for a clear transmission. I just ran a diagnostic on the relay. The signal is green and the pulse is steady. Then the diagnostic is wrong. Sit back down and wait for the weather to clear." "Sir, that message is a primary attack order. If that regiment doesn't jump off, the 5th on their flank won't have any cover. The 5th is being sent into a meat grinder by men who don't care if those boys ever come back. That isn't your call to make, Lieutenant. It's the only call that matters. I'm not sending more boys to die just because some general wants a headline. You're holding a legal combat essential order. That's dereliction. I'm saving 40 lives by letting them sleep through a suicide mission. Go back to your station. The line is open, sir." "I'm sending it now. Step away from that radio, Sergeant. That's a direct order. I'm a radio operator, Lieutenant. My order came from 3rd Army HQ at 0200. I'm fulfilling it. You've just signed their death warrants. You have no idea what you've done." Rita didn't answer. She turned and walked back to her desk. Her fingers hit the key with a rhythmic, mechanical fury. The dots and dashes of the Morse code cut through the night, but the silence of the last 3 hours had already done its work. The message was away, but the clock had run out. Rita finished the transmission and immediately picked up the landline to the battalion command post. She bypassed the lieutenant and asked for the duty officer. She reported the delay, the false claim of a downed line, and the lieutenant's refusal to act. The report moved up through the signal battalion, past the colonels, and into the hands of a man who tolerated many things, but never a broken promise. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's open jeep pulled up to the mud-caked entrance of the relay station just as the first gray light of dawn broke through the clouds. He stepped out of the vehicle before it had even fully stopped. The 4 silver stars on his helmet, polished to a mirror finish, despite the surrounding filth. The ivory grips of his revolvers remained holstered as he walked inside, his presence alone forcing the air out of the room. Every radio operator froze in place. Sergeant Dominguez snapped to a sharp attention, but the general's eyes were fixed only on the lieutenant, sitting behind the stack of logbooks. He walked straight to Sheridan's desk and looked down at the message slip. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with a thin, sharp rasp that cut through the humming electronic equipment like a razor. "Is this the message you received at 0200 hours, Lieutenant?" "Yes, General." "Did you intentionally withhold this order from the regiment?" "I did, sir." "On what authority did you countermand a direct combat directive from my headquarters?" "On the authority of my own conscience, sir. I believed the mission was a suicide run, and I chose to delay it." Patton picked up the slip and turned it over. He stared at the 2 words scribbled in pencil. "I'm sorry." Patton read the words aloud, his voice devoid of any warmth. He let the paper flutter back onto the desk. "You wrote these words because you thought you were being a savior," he began. "You looked at the casualty reports from the last month and decided that you were the only man in the 3rd Army who valued human life. You sat in this warm room and decided that your personal feelings were more important than the lives of an entire division. But you didn't save anyone, Sheridan. You just changed who got killed. At 0500, the flanking regiment jumped off on schedule. They moved into the valley, expecting support on their left flank. They walked into a German crossfire because the men who were supposed to be there were still in their blankets, waiting for the order you chose to hide. 42 men are dead in that gap right now because you decided they didn't deserve the support they were counting on. Sergeant Dominguez tried to fix the disaster you created. She understood what you failed to learn. In combat, the unit is a single body. When one limb refuses to move, the whole body bleeds out. You didn't show mercy. You showed a vanity that cost 42 mothers their sons. If you disagreed with the order, you had a chain of command. You had a voice to speak up through proper channels. Instead, you chose a silence that killed your fellow soldiers. You aren't a savior. You are a man who betrayed his post, while better people paid the price for your ego. You have 2 options. You will go to the casualty collection point and help load those 42 bodies into the trucks with your own hands, or you will surrender your belt and wait for the military police to take you to a cell for a court-martial. Choose one in the next 10 seconds. Sheridan stood paralyzed. His clean uniform and his intellectual moral high ground were gone, replaced by the weight of names he would never know. He looked at the floor and reached for his buckle. The military police did not offer the lieutenant the dignity of a jeep ride. They marched him through the freezing mud toward the rear of the regiment's position, where the silence was finally broken by the sound of idling truck engines and the rhythmic thud of heavy canvas hitting wood. Sheridan was forced into the back of a deuce-and-a-half truck filled with 42 olive-drab blankets. The air here was heavy with the metallic scent of blood and the damp, cloying smell of earth from the valley floor. His tailored jacket, once so pristine in the relay station, was quickly stained by the dark, cold moisture soaking through the wool. He had to lift them one by one. He felt the weight of every man who had been caught in the crossfire he allowed to happen. Soldiers from the surviving companies stood in a grim circle, their faces hollow and gray, watching the officer who had decided their lives weren't worth a transmission. There was no shouting, only the wet slap of the mud and the unbearable sound of zippers. As he gripped the cold handles of the last litter, Sheridan finally understood that the 3 hours he had stolen were not a gift of mercy, but a debt paid in the weight of the men he now carried. Sergeant Rita Dominguez returned to El Paso in 1946. She was awarded the Bronze Star for her initiative and served a long, quiet career with the Southwestern Bell Telephone Company. She rarely spoke about the war, but she kept a framed photo of her signal unit on her desk until her death in 1994. To her family, she was a woman of deep integrity who believed that a message sent was a promise kept. She lived long enough to see the sons of the men she tried to save grow into old men, never knowing that her defiance had been their only hope in a dark valley. Paul Sheridan served 3 years in a military prison before returning to Oregon. He worked in minor administrative jobs, but could never escape the quiet judgment of those who knew his history. He lived alone in a small house overlooking the Pacific and died in 1982. He left behind a small box containing 42 spent shell casings and a worn unit roster from that November morning. He spent a lifetime trying to wash the mud of France from his hands, but the stain of 42 lives was a color that never faded. General Patton kept the message slip with the words, "I am sorry," in his personal field desk for the remainder of the war. He mentioned the case once in a letter to his wife, writing that the most dangerous weapon in any army is a man who thinks he is kinder than the requirements of victory. To Patton, the tragedy was not that a man felt pity, but that he used that pity to build a grave for others. He never forgot the 42, seeing them as a silent jury that followed every commander who ever issued an order. Some historians argue that Patton's treatment of Lieutenant Sheridan was harsh, reflecting a rigid military mind that failed to account for the psychological exhaustion of the men under his command. They suggest that Sheridan's act was a symptom of morale collapse rather than a criminal one. Others argue that Patton's response was the only logical reaction in a high-stakes environment, where a single break in the chain of command results in mass casualties. They contend that the survival of the unit must always outweigh the personal convictions of an individual officer. What is certain is that the failure at Pont-à-Mousson remains a permanent lesson in the lethal reality of a single delayed signal. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have issued the same mirrored punishment, or would you have shown more mercy for the officer's internal struggle? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the moments that forced people to face what they'd done, make sure to subscribe.